A common complaint you'll hear is this: the news media is biased. Public opinion surveys show that more than 70% of Americans often make that claim, and the number seems to rise each year. That accusation is particularly troubling to journalists. It calls into question the very standards of their profession. Journalists are trained to verify information and to be as impartial as possible. That is, to be independent from outside influences and personal beliefs. And one reason news organizations put reporters' names on stories is to ensure those journalists are accountable if they fail to maintain proper impartiality. The goal of this lesson is to define journalistic bias and then to help you spot it. Just as important, however, will be your ability to recognize unfounded charges of bias. Those may prevent you from finding reliable and actionable information. Let's start with the definition of bias. A predisposition that distorts your ability to fairly weigh the evidence and prevents you from reaching a fair or accurate judgment. Notice the word predisposition. That means that the bias comes before the effort to verify and report a story. Based on this definition, how can you go about finding bias in the news media? The essential step: look for a pattern of unfairness. One instance of unfairness may be the result of a number of different causes and may not necessarily be evidence of bias. Perhaps the journalists rushed to share a story and got sloppy. Perhaps obstacles prevented the reporters from interviewing every relevant party. Perhaps they made an honest mistake. Journalists are human, and as in every profession, they make mistakes. You don't assume a doctor is incompetent or worse if she misdiagnoses a patient's illness, but a constant failure to make a proper diagnosis would be proof that she's a terrible doctor. Likewise, if journalists and news outlets demonstrate a consistent pattern of unfairness over time, that should lead you to question their reliability. For example, if a news website consistently shows only unflattering pictures of a politician, it's reasonable to suspect that bias is at work here. Or if a news network time and again only interviews supporters of a new publicly funded football stadium, there's a good chance you've spotted bias. Though bias in the news media clearly exists, be on guard against common flaws in claims of bias. The news media is biased is a blanket statement that is difficult to prove. Be skeptical of the charge that the opinion side of news influences or dictates the reporting. There is a long tradition of commentary in the news media. In professional news organizations, the views expressed on editorial pages do not influence the work of reporters. Be cautious when looking for patterns. The fact that a news outlet covers a controversial story is not evidence that the journalists are endorsing one side of the debate. News editors exercise their best judgment and, as we've seen, take into account many factors when determining just what stories to cover. Covering the trial of an elected official does not mean that the news outlet endorses any particular outcome of the trial. Such a story contains several news drivers, including importance, conflict, and prominence. So it should not be a surprise when it is featured in news reports. The official may charge the news media with bias, but keep in mind that he is attempting to save his own skin. The failure to cover a story is not necessarily evidence of bias either. Editors and producers consider many stories, and their judgment may lead them to exclude certain stories in favor of ones they find more important and more interesting to their audience. To sum up, when attempting to spot bias, look for a pattern of unfairness over time. Compare and contrast coverage across a variety of news outlets, especially when searching for bias that may come from omission. And lastly, take note of the self-interest of those who allege bias. Accusations of bias often come from individuals whose own bias leads them to scapegoat the news media.